All right, Annette, you are live.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for joining us for this month's training intensive. The topic is double abuse when helping actually harms. I'm Annette Oltmans, and I'm founder of the Men Project. We are a nonprofit organization. We are dedicated to educating, equipping, and restoring all those impacted by abuse. How do we do this? Well, we provide tools and resources to victims to help them find clarity and tools for them to advocate for themselves. And then we also train and equip those on the front lines, the first responders, those who are in position to respond to abuse so that they can do so in healing ways and avoid causing double abuse, our topic for today. So central to our organization's vision is our goal to put an end to double abuse. Double abuse is a term I coined to describe the harm that is caused when persons responding to a victim's disclosure of abuse either ignore their pleas for help, wrongly judge them, disbelieve them, criticize them, instruct them in ways that they should be performing better to minimize the abuse, or they minimize their own perspective and say it's not so bad. They may even shun them. They may just completely pull away and say, when someone discloses abuse, I'm not going to talk to that person anymore. I don't believe them. So rather than responding with support and compassion, these individuals further traumatize the victim in a time of great vulnerability and need. Double abuse is a form of condemnation. It's important to understand that double abuse is an all too common experience for at least two reasons. The first is that well-meaning responders are uneducated. They don't understand what constitutes abuse, and they're ill-equipped to understand any of the natures of abuse or to understand what harm actually is. So they don't respond in a trauma-informed way. The other reason is that many still reject the idea of abuse or have no real intention to help victims. They just don't want to get involved, or they may judge victims for staying, or they judge victims for leaving. They often tell the victim that she needs to change her behaviors so the abuser will stop, as though anything the victim does will change an abuser. The point is that they withhold compassion and instead enact condemnation. Regardless of which type of first responder the victim speaks to, the victim vulnerably shares their story, desperately seeking and hoping to receive a safe place to process their confusing experience and receive the help they desperately need. It is because of the victim's state of deep vulnerability at the time of disclosure that the person responding to abuse holds such great power to either empower the victim or to push them into further oppression. So I don't normally talk about my story, but today I thought, because I experienced a lot of double abuse, I thought it would be helpful for me to share what happened in my life. I was married to someone who was very emotionally abusive, not in the typical ways. So I was very confused. I didn't understand that what I was experiencing was emotional abuse. It was not overt emotional abuse, such as raging or name calling. In fact, he never did those things. It was more covert and manipulative. He would stonewall me and not show me empathy or compassion. And there was no reciprocity. It was very confusing. He would use a multitude of what we call and what we have available on our website, a list of terms and definitions that describe covert emotionally abusive behaviors that deflect, that are defensive, that reverse the blame and put the victim always laying the responsibility of every issue at the victim's feet. So I decided that what happened to me was I unknowingly at the time developed post-traumatic stress disorder, which enhanced or intensified my confusion, because that's part of the emotional side effects of PTSD. And what PTSD also does is that it causes physiological problems. Your immune system becomes compromised because of the prolonged stress and confusion, and you start to develop autoimmune problems, which I had a series of different autoimmune illnesses. I even developed what's called latent autoimmune diabetes and had to be on a significant amount of medication. I lost a lot of weight. I was very frail and meek. And the more that I was beaten down emotionally in this, not physically, but emotionally in my marriage, the more I doubted myself. I doubted my point of view and my perspective, and thought, gosh, am I not communicating effectively? Why is he not hearing me? Am I unlovable? Like, maybe I just don't know how to have a good, healthy relationship. Maybe it's me. The more that you're undermined, the more you don't have the clarity to really understand your circumstances. Like, I had never even heard of emotional abuse before. I didn't know that it was a form of domestic violence. And so the more that you internalize and blame yourself, the more you lose the ability to have clarity and the proper perspective. So what I did was, I was part of a couples Bible study for 14 years. And I reached out to the female leader of my Bible study group. And I was literally in a heap of tears, very broken and concerned and worried. I wanted to help my marriage. We had been in therapy the entire marriage, and I was married for 15 years at the time of this experience. Excuse me. So I had made the conscious decision to separate from my husband, because I knew my body couldn't endure any more stress. And I experienced the abuse escalating. It was more frequent. He would punish me by not communicating with me, sometimes for a day, sometimes for several weeks. And so this just put so much pressure and tension inside the household that I just couldn't tolerate physiologically the stress anymore. And so I sought and implemented a marital separation. And I stopped going to couples therapy, because in our last month's intensive training, I spoke about why couples therapy is harmful when you're dealing with a narcissist or an abuser. And similarly, in our situation, couples therapy was harmful and traumatic, because they never uncovered the abuse. They were ill-equipped, even though we went to renowned therapists, but they were not, and I've learned this, they're not often equipped to identify abuse, to name it, to confront it, and to demand its resolve, and to separate the couple out of couples therapy. And so it was very stressful, and I stopped couples therapy. I went to my Bible study leader and shared in the best way that I could, with the limited knowledge that I had at the time, that the stress and the tension and the maltreatment and the unloving experiences were so intense and so blaming of me that I couldn't endure it anymore. But she couldn't sit with me in my place. She couldn't in my space that I was in at the time. She refused to acknowledge what I was saying and to believe me. She interrupted me, and that's a form of double abuse. Interrupting and interrogating, asking pointed questions that placed me in the seat of responsibility. Well, if you would do this better, then he wouldn't do that. Or, well, don't you think it's the way you're acting? What are you doing that's causing this? And just basically a refusal to allow me to process out loud with her what I was experiencing, because the interruptions were very frequent. She just never allowed me to express what I was trying to express, and then began judging me and like I said, interrogating and criticizing me. And so I went back to her at a later date with an advocate to try to validate what was going through and what I was going through, and still the same maltreatment. It was very judgmental. It was, I need to submit more. I need to cook dinners, you know, every night. I need to do this, that, like very just unwise counsel, and a refusal to accept my story to be true. And then I received a phone call from her husband and he prefaced it by saying, Annette, this is going to be a very difficult discussion, but if you are not back in couples therapy within 90 days, you will never be invited back into our group. So they took a stance that what I was doing was wrong and that what my husband was doing was right. So I was the one responsible to hold the marriage together, I was responsible for everything, basically. And when I did not comply, which I knew I couldn't tolerate anymore of this dysfunctional therapy sessions that were diving into the minutia of problems rather than seeing the patterns of behaviors that I was trying to highlight to show this pattern of maltreatment. They wanted me to stay in that. And so when I refused to comply, they just never spoke to me again. They just cut. Oh, they also gave me one other condition that I think happens to a lot of victims in abusive situations. They are classified as a gossip for saying anything to disparage their spouse. And so they basically said, the women sent me a message. I had one couple in this group that stood by me. They didn't leave the Bible study or anything like that, but they advocated for me and said it wasn't right what they were doing. And she delivered me a message that said that the other women in the group will only see you again if you agree to never bring up the name of your husband. And so here, this is supposed to be a small group where we had traveled the world together, gone on mission trips, broken bread every Thanksgiving and Christmas, and met weekly for 14 years, where people were free to bring their concerns, their burdens, their challenges. And yet I was silenced. I was not allowed to speak. And I was classified as somebody who was disparaging my husband in an unchristian way, in a sinful way. And ironically, what they then did is they breached my confidentiality to the whole group, and then they went into the broader community and breached my confidentiality there and encouraged people not to speak with me because they wanted to drive me back into couples therapy. And this is an example of double abuse where judgment comes in, when you wrongly judge a situation, and then you begin imposing ultimatums and obligations on the victim. And I want to take a moment to also pause and say, I went to confide in my Bible study leader. Everyone in the group was, other than the one couple that stood with me, everyone else in the group was 10 years older than I was. And I looked to the leaders as my spiritual counselors. And so it was a shocking experience when I did not receive their support. And I went to them also because I did not want to disparage my husband in public. I wanted to go to what I thought was a safe place. And I think a lot of victims make this mistake. They go to people who they know will love their spouse and that love them, and I thought they loved me. And so I felt that they, more than anyone else, would be able to treat him fairly, treat me fairly, and help lead us towards help. I was asking for one thing, that my husband engage an accountability partner. And I said I would do anything if he would do that one thing, which he refused. And because I wanted transparency, I wanted another set of eyes to be able to validate my experiences. And so they would say things like, you need an accountability partner, because the mistake that victims make by going to someone who really loves the spouse is that they have a tainted point of view. You know, most abusers work really hard at being, at their image management. It's one of the pillars of abuse. And so they present themselves as very cool, calm, collected, charming. My husband had a very good reputation in the business world. It was very fair-minded and honorable. And so it just seemed so too contrary to them to believe that he could be mistreating me. And so that's a mistake that victims make, is they go to somebody who they think will be safe, but who has a bias, an unconscious bias about the person. And then what they end up doing is giving preferential treatment to this favored individual who they feel they need to defend because they're now disparaged. And so it's really important in a situation like this to choose wisely the safe person you're going to confide in. And it's very disappointing because when you're trying to save your marriage, and you're trying to look for solutions, it would seem common sense to seek out people who love both of you. But it's often, they're just ill-equipped, they're uneducated about abuse, and so they respond in all the ways that constitute double abuse. This experience that I had with my Bible study group, excuse me one second, was devastating. It was overwhelming because now, and my story is not unique. This happens to so many. I've interviewed hundreds of survivors who've shared their personal experience, both with original abuse and then double abuse. And this is a very common scenario. The double abuse was so severely traumatic that it just completely collapsed my immune system. And I subsequently ended up going to the hospital like 13 different times, into the emergency room for unstable blood sugar, unstable blood pressure. I could tell you a lot of stories about that, but we don't have time today. And so because I had already had post-traumatic stress disorder, this double layer of trauma exacerbated my PTSD into what is called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a much more difficult form of trauma to heal. Now, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. Oftentimes, the hurt that victims feel from the double abuse is deeper and harder to heal from than from the original abuse. So often when I'm interviewing victims, that's the part they want to talk about. That's the part that's sitting with them and just doesn't leave their mind, how severe and how they just were shocked by the maltreatment. It was the last thing they expected. And so the disparity between their expectation and what actually happened was so severe, it was very traumatizing. Victims often will reach out to responders who they feel will not judge their spouse, like I said. And so this backfires. And so I just want you to really understand that when that backfires, the victim is thrown into a position of what we call hopelessness and despair. And in my case, because they reached out, this was my most important social circle, or at least spiritual circle. I had other social friends in the broader community, but because I felt this was my small church, I lost a sense of my personal identity because I no longer was allowed a place in this community. I lost attachment to people who I thought loved me. I lost attachment to hope. And so when victims experience double abuse, oftentimes it's that loss of hope, that feeling of I won't be able to find help. And also they went out into the community and were slandering me. And so I was losing, my reputation as a good person, which I was. And so suddenly I have a group of people who are influential, who are slandering me and taking my identity away from me. And when you have a loss of your identity and you experience hopelessness, you will experience complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Some victims experience complex PTSD in their original relationship because of certain circumstances, they have a sense of hopelessness that they won't ever be able to get out, like in physically violent relationships and so forth. But oftentimes complex PTSD sets in motion at the place when double abuse occurs. So why create a term like double abuse? To me, it was important to give it a name. The term is not meant, however, to like label. It's not, the intention isn't to label responders as abusers, but rather to accurately describe the harm that it causes to victims. And by giving it a name and describing how significantly it exacerbates a victim's trauma, their symptoms, we help first responders better understand their role, their important role that they play when a victim experiences abuse and when they are vulnerable to disclose it. When victims experience this secondary layer of harm, the term double abuse helps victims feel validated regarding their traumatic experience. It helps them better understand that it's not their fault, and it helps to clarify their experience rather than going into a place where they reject themselves as someone who deserved this maltreatment. Double abuse comes in many forms. I know a woman who was a devoted and highly knowledgeable Bible study leader. And I'm sorry, I'm using two different church examples, and I don't mean to attack the church. It's just that unfortunately, the church should be the safest place to go. And if the church hasn't been trained in abuse, sadly, they let a lot of victims down. And so another example is that I know a woman who was a devoted and highly knowledgeable Bible study leader for over 20 years. Her husband, however, was emotionally abusive and had numerous affairs. Now, she finally filed for divorce and separated from him. But then she was removed from teaching Bible study by the organizational leaders because now she was not working on her marriage, but she was separated and stepping towards divorce. And this is something that frequently happens. The husband doesn't lose his position in his corporate environment, but she was ostracized. Her identity in her spiritual community was stripped away from her. This form of condemnation in the church is rampant, regardless of how well qualified and devoted the victim has been over a long extended period of time. Suddenly the credibility is taken away from her. It's minimized. She was an admired leader who helped many women over the years, and yet she was deemed good enough as long as she was enduring the abuse and the affairs. But when she stepped away from her marriage, she was now suddenly deemed unfit. And there's so many stories where this has occurred. And it's not a unique problem. It is prolific. Okay, excuse me 1 second. Okay, so stepping away from a church example, I want to just take a minute to tell you about my granddaughter. And I do talk about this more deeply in our introductory training, but basically she was molested. My granddaughter came forward that she had been molested by a cousin. And the family broke apart because on the abuser's side, they refused to believe her, or they minimized it. Oh, it wasn't that bad. It was only this or that. Or we just want to play neutral. We don't want to get involved. They didn't support her. They didn't validate her for her courage coming forward. And it basically broke the family into, there was just a huge chasm. They would say she's lying, and all kinds of things that doubly abused my granddaughter. And this experience of double abuse and the breakup of the family caused her to feel a loss, that she lost her identity in the broader family. And she was inaccurately, she was wrongly portrayed. She was mischaracterized, just as I had been mischaracterized in my situation. And that mischaracterization causes you to lose your sense of identity. And so it sent my granddaughter into the hospital numerous times, into the emergency room, because her blood pressure was unstable. And it was the timing of this situation was very similar to the timing of my situation, which allowed me to see through another lens what had happened to me. And that's one reason why I really wanted to form the Men Project and really talk about this phenomenon of double abuse. I just want to point out that in this family that disparaged her or played neutral or didn't want to get involved, they had an unconscious bias. And that bias was their staunch allegiance to the matriarch of the family, the mother of the abuser, who basically controlled the family. And so their allegiance to the matriarch rose above their obligation to a minor child. And we see this kind of unconscious bias and cultural allegiance in social settings, in family dynamics. We see this in institutions, in corporate environments, where they just will follow the leader, regardless of the moral obligation to the victim. And this form of group double abuse is prolific and it's very damaging. Next month, we're going to talk about our healing model of compassion, which in our training intensive, which provides a clear map to avoiding causing double abuse. And in that training, we're going to discuss more deeply the overt forms of double abuse, but we'll also be able to take a deeper dive into the more subtle forms, the way people doubly abuse victims through behaviors such as like not wanting to get involved. Well, that form of apathy might seem benign to some, but it is a disconnection from the victim. And so we're going to talk more about those forms of double abuse and how to avoid it. Or they might say, we don't want to choose sides, so they play neutral. But in a neutral, if you take a neutral position, you actually benefit only one person, and that's the abuser. Or they might just ignore the person, or they might withdraw for the victim and say, I don't want to get involved, or I can't talk to him or her anymore because they don't listen to my advice. You're giving them advice even though the victim knows best what is right and what they need. And so there's so many more subtle forms of double abuse that we'll be able to get into in our next month's training. So I want to close by saying, if you haven't subscribed to our blog, please do so. This past week, we shared a story of a man who was emotionally, physically, and sexually abused by his wife. His children were also abused. He had to change his legal counsel because his lawyer didn't believe that men could possibly be abused by a woman. And that disbelief was a form of severe double abuse. It's not just that the attorney minimized his experience, he absolutely refused to believe that his story was plausible. And so when you're advocating for the health and well-being of your child and your own attorney refuses to believe you, it's very traumatic. It also points to some of the cultural and gender stereotypes that some carry in an unconscious bias, which interferes with providing a proper response. So many people think that men cannot be abused, and it's wrong because they can. And so men who have been abused often have an even harder time getting proper interventions and support. It's hard for me to close without providing you with all the effective resources the MEND Project has created to help first responders when they are addressing people that have been harmed by abuse. But that's why we have our 4-hour introductory training, which we'll be making available to the public for only $75 a person in the month of April. Also, you can gain additional tools and resources through our educational website by visiting themendproject.com. There, you can subscribe to our weekly blog. You can tap into a number of resources that are free and downloadable on PDF form, which will not only help victims advocate for themselves and find clarity about their own emotionally abusive situations, but it will give tools and insight to first responders, to therapists, to pastors, and so forth. And finally, I'm so excited, but let me take a sip of water. This year, we are finally launching what we have been working on for years, the virtual format of our comprehensive curriculum. It's a 7-session deep dive into emotional abuse, double abuse, trauma, and healthy response protocols. And this training is available to churches, to therapy groups, to nonprofit organizations that are serving the marginalized population on the front line. It's available to victims. It's available to anyone. And so we just hope that you will sign up on our website. If you are attending a church and you feel they don't understand double abuse, or if you're having trouble with your therapist understanding what you're going through, it would be great to recommend them to attend this training. And also, finally, we will be back next month on March 25th at 10 a.m. for our next training intensive, and we hope you will join us then. And so now I'd like to break into a time of Q&A if anyone has any questions. And Lauren, how do they reach you with your questions?
So if you are on Facebook, just leave them in the comments below. And if you are on Zoom with us here, you can leave them in the chat box and we'll read them out, and Annette, you can answer them. We do have some already.
All right.
All right. So can a victim who often is in a very vulnerable state at the time, how do they determine that safe place for them to share that story? And how do they determine that a person is actually a safe person to share their story with?
Well, that's a great question. What victims will often want to do, which is what I talked about earlier, is what I wanted to do, was to seek support from someone that could actually help both my husband and me, that would love both of us. But I just really caution that what a victim needs to do is to tap into someone that might not necessarily be friends of both of you, but because the only way you're going to be able to get help for an abusive spouse is by setting boundaries, and firm boundaries, and being willing to follow up on the ultimatum, on the consequence, and just to be able to articulate your experience, like listing out the behaviors that you will not tolerate. And you often can't even get to that place to speak to your spouse until you have a safe friend to confide in that will allow you to process your experience out loud to try to help you gain the clarity. You could go like the other thing, let me back up. You can what is a safe thing to do is to just speak a little bit about your experience, and not tell the whole story, but try to take baby steps into the conversation. And if they are empathetic and they believe you and support you, then it's probably safer to tell a little more. But I wouldn't risk telling everything to someone and then they're unsafe and they breach your confidentiality and go talk to your spouse or something like that, that would just put you in a really compromised situation where you would experience retaliation and other forms of exacerbated abuse by your spouse or your partner. So I would gingerly step into the conversation. I would choose somebody who's really aligned with you, who knows your character, who trusts you, or I would go to a domestic violence agency and talk to a counselor there. And I would take a personal empowerment program because that's a safe environment. The problem is that so many victims don't understand that they're dealing with abuse. They are just confused. They think they have a complicated relationship. So it's always just safer in any problems that we bring forward to test the waters a little bit first and to just check your gut to see the kind of response that you're getting, if it's safe and loving or if it's critical and judgmental, and if it's giving you instructions, telling you what to do rather than just listening to you, holding your hand and supporting you.
So another question that came in, I think I've witnessed double abuse. If I am part of a group that I know is doubly abusing a victim, what should I do? Should I address it? Should I leave? I'm so confused.
Well, it's great that you are recognizing that. What I would do is it takes a lot of courage though to go up against a group, but I would lay out the reasons why it's doubly abusive, why their behaviors are doubly abusive. I would lay out those reasons, and then I would confront them. I would say, this is wrong. And maybe you do that one person at a time. Maybe you do it as a group, call a meeting. Or if you feel that it is so entrenched and that they're so unhealthy emotionally, then I would step away. Because when you align with the doubly abusive people that are being abusive, that is sending a message that is traumatizing the victim. They need allegiance. They need 100% allegiance. So you can become an advocate and try to help the situation in a compassionate way, to really lay this out. And if they don't respond well, then that may be your time to exit. But I know that this takes a lot of courage, and I just wish you well on this journey.
Another question that we got was, how do I communicate this phenomenon of double abuse to a therapist who is guilty of this? As I am addressing several different issues. I'm trying to find help for my daughter, and I'm in a situation of intimate partner violence by proxy. The daughter is being used as a weapon by her father. How do I address the double abuse?
Well, what you can do is you can go to our website and pull materials from our website that describe double abuse. And you can show the name it for what it is, and then sit with the therapist and just lay that out. And if the therapist is not going to be responsive, if therapists should have no reason to get defensive. Defensiveness is not meant for the therapeutic setting. If a therapist gets defensive, you're not with a healthy therapist, because they should be able to leave their own defenses outside the therapeutic setting. So I don't know your ability to change therapists. Maybe you're unable to because the father is controlling the therapeutic experience as well. I don't know, but if there was any way, if you bring this up and you try to articulate it, and you can use words from our website, if you can try to articulate it and they don't respond well, it is a red flag that you need to exit and find somebody else. There's nothing wrong with leaving a therapist. If they're not being helpful, then there's no reason that you need to stay there.
And a comment and a question we got from Facebook. Thank you for sharing and sharing your personal experience. You mentioned stepping out of couples therapy at the time. Did you continue in therapy individually, or was therapy too traumatic altogether?
No, actually, it's a great question. I had so many different therapeutic encounters, and they were harmful. I mean, to give you one example, there was one therapist who's on the radio. He's well-renowned, written tons of books, came highly recommended. And he just each time wanted to talk about the minutia. But why did you leave the restaurant? Or why did you get out of the car? Or that, I can't remember but he would just want to go into the minutia instead of seeing the top line patterns that were playing out. The dynamic in our therapeutic setting was I was being falsely accused each time. So I was defending myself. And I'm sorry, now I forgot the question. Tell me again, Lauren.
At the time, did you continue?
Oh yeah, did I go on with other therapy? So I had witnessed these behaviors by therapists that were really wrong. And so I then went on a journey of shopping for a therapist. And I would call the therapist and I would tell them I'm going to shop. I'm shopping for a therapist. I ended up interviewing 11 therapists before I found someone that I knew in my gut was trauma informed, was going to meet me where I was in that fragile place that I was. I was so traumatized, and to be able to help me overcome my trauma and also help me strengthen my voice. My husband and I ultimately were able to save our marriage. I'm not recommending that, but I separated and worked on myself to get stronger and to really be able to have the stamina to hold firm boundaries. And I needed help with that. And a therapist really helped me find my voice. And ultimately, that strong stance that I took, where I was unwavering, led my husband into getting the right kind of therapy. I actually screened the therapist first and knew that he was an expert in emotional abuse, and basically wouldn't tolerate my husband seeing any other therapist. I laid out the parameters for the separation. It was a controlled separation. And I had a therapist on my side fully helping me the entire time with that. And I would just email my husband's therapist to say, this is what took place, even though we weren't seeing each other, still dynamics were happening. And I would say, this is what he said to me this week. This is what he wrote to me this week. And to keep that therapist able to confront him, and I could keep myself safe and having the support of somebody who was fully and completely aligned with me.
Mm. Yeah. All right. One last question, and then we got a comment in. So I can so relate to this experience of double abuse. I've experienced it myself. I so want to help others who have experienced this pain. Do you all have a way I can share my story?
We love to hear people's stories. Stories are so helpful in not only helpful for you in your own journey to put it in writing, or for anyone to put in writing. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to share it publicly. But what we do at the Mend Project is we change your name, but we share your story. And if you write it, we can even help you write it. We often work with victims to write their story. Stories help others understand what is often difficult to explain unless you're told it through a story. So we hold your stories sacred. We really value them. And yes, we post them. we circulate them like we every once in a while on our blog, like every few blogs, we circulate a story. So we would love to hear from you.
And one last comment. Your experiences are very similar to mine. I was in a church where multiple women were going through this. We could not speak to each other about it. There are now 3 of us who've broken free separately. I'm in contact with them, and this is impacting the children who now ostracize us and identify with their fathers. Either way, the family has been traumatized. This causes so much multi-generational trauma. We need therapists, books, videos, etc., to empower women and men who are being so harmed.
Oh boy, don't I know that. You know, if you haven't listened to our couples therapy, we talk a lot about how people doubly abuse in that setting. I think it would be helpful for you to listen to it. And also, I think it's great that you are connected with these other women. And as hard as it is that the children align with the father, know that this is not uncommon. Oftentimes, they see the victim as unstable because of their post-traumatic stress symptoms, or trying to explain what was happening, but not exactly finding the right words to explain it. So I'd like for you to consider downloading our terms and definitions and writing out what you experienced and how you experienced it, and sitting down with one of your children if they would be willing to do so. And if not, just know that over time, they usually come to terms to see 2 different behaviors from their mother and their father, regardless of which one is the victim. During the process, they often don't want to be the butt of, they don't want to experience the abuse. They don't want to experience judgment. So they align with the person that they're most afraid of. And they feel safer to alienate the person who's safest. So over time, I've seen so many families reconcile and so many victims be reconciled with their adult children, but it is a very, very hard process to go through. And I'm so sorry you're going through this. It's so hard.
Well, I think that's all for today, Annette.
Okay, Lauren. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Again, I just want to say we'll be back next month on March 25th at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's West Coast time for our next training intensive. Basically, we'll be talking about the healing model of compassion and more subtle ways that we doubly abuse. And we hope you will join us then. Thank you so much and have a great day.